Long before the first dinosaur appeared, life came closer to ending than at any other point in Earth's history. 252 million years ago, a catastrophe swept across every ocean and every continent on Earth. 96% of all species vanished. Entire ecosystems collapsed. Ancient groups that had dominated the planet for hundreds of millions of years disappeared. For a brief moment in geological time, Earth became a far emptier place than it had ever been before. Most stories about the Great Dying focus on what was lost. This one begins with what remained. Somehow, a barrel bodied animal with a beak roughly the size of a pig inherited the planet. In the aftermath of the extinction, nearly 9 out of every 10 land animals belonged to a single genus. A small whisker faced creature survived underground while conditions above became increasingly hostile. Its descendants are still here today. In the oceans, dominant shell building animals vanished, replaced by species that had spent most of their history in the background. And perhaps strangest of all, some of the first animals to return to recovering seas appear to have been predators, arriving before scientists expected entire ecosystems to be rebuilt. The extinction killed the giants, the specialists, and many of the creatures that once seemed unstoppable. What survived were the adaptable, the overlooked, and the ordinary. In this video, we're exploring the strangest survivors of Earth's worst extinction and the unlikely traits that allowed a handful of species to outlast the greatest biological disaster our planet has ever known. But before we do, let me know in the comments. Are you listening to this to fall asleep, or you're here only for the knowledge? Now, let's meet the creatures that endured when almost everything else disappeared. Imagine a planet so crowded with life that nearly every corner of land and sea belonged to something. Long before the age of dinosaurs, before familiar birds, mammals, or flowering plants appeared, Earth carried a different cast of inhabitants across a landscape unlike any that exists today. Around 252 million years ago, the world had settled into an immense arrangement known as Pangaea, a single continent stretching across vast distances, surrounded by the endless waters of Panthalassa. Across its interior, seasons could be harsh and dry, yet life flourished on a remarkable scale. Along rivers, floodplains, and coastal regions, ecosystems had spent millions of years refining themselves into intricate networks. Every species occupied a place. Every place supported another layer of life. The result was a biosphere of extraordinary richness, built slowly across spans of time, almost impossible to imagine. Among the most formidable inhabitants were the gorgonopsids. These predators moved on sprawling limbs and carried long saber-like teeth that gave them a fearsome appearance. They were not dinosaurs, nor were they mammals. They belonged to a branch of life entirely their own, rulers of terrestrial food chains for millions of years. Their presence shaped the behavior of countless other creatures that shared their world. Not far away grazed an astonishing variety of dicynodonts. Some were small enough to move quietly through dense vegetation, others reached impressive sizes. Their beaked mouths and sturdy bodies allowed them to consume tough plant matter across many different environments. Dozens of species existed simultaneously, each adapted to slightly different resources and conditions, together forming one of the dominant herbivore groups of the Permian world. Beyond the shorelines, the oceans displayed an abundance equally impressive. Vast stretches of seafloor were covered by brachiopods, shell-bearing animals that filtered nutrients from the water in unimaginable numbers. Their shells created living carpets across marine habitats. Among them wandered trilobites, ancient survivors whose lineage stretched back hundreds of millions of years. They had already endured multiple extinction events and remained familiar inhabitants of the seabed. In warmer, shallow waters, coral reefs rose like submerged cities. Their structures provided shelter, feeding grounds, and breeding sites for thousands of interconnected species. Above these reefs drifted ammonoids, their elegantly coiled shells catching shafts of sunlight as they moved through the water column. Countless relationships linked predator to prey, grazer to plant, reef to ocean current, creating a living system balanced through deep time. On land, forests of conifers and seed ferns bordered rivers and coastal plains. Beneath their canopies, giant dragonflies with wingspans approaching 30 centimeters hunted through humid air. Everywhere, life occupied available space, filling ecological roles refined across ages. What makes this world remarkable is not only its diversity, but its apparent permanence. Many of these groups had existed for immense stretches of geological time. They seemed woven securely into Earth's fabric, as though they would always remain. Yet almost every creature described here stood near the edge of disappearance. Soon, entire branches of life would vanish. Ecosystems that had taken millions of years to assemble would collapse. The survivors of that catastrophe matter precisely because so much of this world did not survive. To understand what endured, it is first necessary to appreciate the scale of what was lost. The beginning arrived not as a single moment, but as a process unfolding across immense stretches of time. Deep beneath what is now northern Russia, the crust of the earth began to fracture. From those wounds emerged one of the largest volcanic events the planet has ever experienced. Layer upon layer of molten rock poured across the landscape, spreading outward until an enormous region became buried beneath lava. Today, this volcanic province is known as the Siberian Traps. For roughly 700,000 years, eruptions continued with astonishing persistence. More than 3 million cubic kilometers of molten material reached the surface. The lava itself was destructive, yet the greater transformation came from what accompanied it. Vast quantities of carbon dioxide, sulfur dioxide, chlorine, and other gases escaped into the atmosphere, slowly altering the chemistry of the planet. As concentrations of greenhouse gases increased, temperatures climbed. In geological terms, the warming happened with startling speed. Global conditions shifted by more than 10 degrees Celsius, disrupting systems that had remained relatively stable for millions of years. Regions once capable of supporting diverse ecosystems became increasingly difficult places to survive. Climate belts migrated, rainfall patterns changed, habitats that countless species depended upon began to unravel. The atmosphere carried another burden as well. Sulfur rich emissions combined with moisture to produce acid rain that fell across immense portions of Pangaea. Forests, already stressed by changing temperatures, faced additional pressure. Soils lost nutrients. Freshwater systems absorbed chemical disturbances that rippled through food webs. Rivers transported these effects toward the sea, linking terrestrial and marine crises into a single expanding chain of disruption. Meanwhile, the oceans were undergoing changes of their own. Warmer water retains less dissolved oxygen than cooler water. As temperatures rose, oxygen concentrations declined across broad marine regions. Areas that had once supported thriving communities gradually became hostile to complex organisms. Vast stretches of seafloor transformed into oxygen poor environments where survival became increasingly difficult. The warming seas also disturbed reservoirs of methane trapped within sediments beneath the ocean floor. As these deposits destabilized, methane entered the water and atmosphere. Because methane is a particularly powerful greenhouse gas, its release amplified existing warming, strengthening the cycle already underway. Each change reinforced the next, creating a cascade of environmental pressures rather than a single isolated catastrophe. In the depths of oxygen starved waters, anaerobic bacteria expanded into habitats previously unavailable to them. These microorganisms produced hydrogen sulfide, a toxic gas capable of poisoning many forms of complex life. In some regions, it appears to have risen from deeper layers into shallower waters, adding another obstacle to survival in ecosystems already under severe strain. No single factor acted alone. Heat, acidification, oxygen loss, toxic chemistry, ecological collapse, and atmospheric instability accumulated together. Species adapted to one challenge often faced several others simultaneously. The result was a biological contraction unlike anything else known from the fossil record. Approximately 81% of marine species disappeared. Around 70% of land vertebrates vanished. One out of every three insect families was lost. Trilobites, survivors of previous global crises and inhabitants of Earth's oceans for roughly 270 million years, reached the end of their story. Against this backdrop, the existence of any survivors at all becomes one of the most remarkable chapters in the history of life. After a catastrophe strips away much of life's complexity, the world does not remain empty for long. New patterns begin to appear in the fossil record. Certain organisms, once ordinary and easily overlooked, suddenly become astonishingly common. Their remains accumulate in great numbers, spreading across landscapes and seascapes that had recently witnessed widespread collapse. Paleontologists have a name for these unexpected rulers of damaged worlds: disaster taxa. The term describes species that rapidly expand after mass extinctions, taking advantage of ecological opportunities left behind by vanished competitors. Before a crisis, they are often minor members of their communities. They occupy modest roles and attract little attention beside larger, more specialized, or more successful neighbors. Yet, when environmental upheaval removes those dominant forms, these quiet survivors find themselves in a transformed world with countless vacant niches. What makes disaster taxa remarkable is not superiority in the traditional sense. They are rarely the strongest, fastest, largest, or most sophisticated organisms in their ecosystems. Instead, they possess traits that become valuable when stability disappears. Many can consume a wide variety of food. Others tolerate conditions that would stress more specialized species. They often reproduce quickly, mature earlier, and require fewer resources to maintain their populations. In normal times, these characteristics may provide only modest advantages. During a biological crisis, they become powerful tools. A creature capable of feeding on several food sources is less vulnerable when one disappears. An animal able to endure fluctuations in temperature, oxygen, or habitat quality can persist where others cannot. Flexibility becomes more important than perfection. Adaptability becomes more useful than efficiency. The Great Dying produced the most dramatic example of this phenomenon known from Earth's history. The extinction removed such an extraordinary proportion of species that ecosystems were left with vast ecological vacancies. Entire food webs lost their dominant participants. Predators vanished. Herbivores vanished. Reef builders vanished. Long established communities fragmented into scattered remnants. Across land and sea, opportunities appeared on a scale rarely seen before or since. Into this emptiness stepped a handful of survivors that expanded with remarkable speed. They did more than endure difficult conditions. They became the framework upon which recovering ecosystems were built. For millions of years, These organisms shaped the appearance of the post extinction world. Their dominance was not permanent, but it was profound. They occupied roles once held by a much broader diversity of species, creating ecosystems that were simpler, less varied, and heavily influenced by a few successful lineages. Among the most important of these disaster taxa was a stout herbivore named Lystrosaurus. On land, its fossils became so abundant that entire rock formations seem almost defined by its presence. In the oceans, a humble shell bearing animal called Chlorea achieved a comparable success. Though very different from one another, both shared the qualities repeatedly seen among post extinction survivors: resilience, flexibility, and an ability to thrive where many others could not. The story of disaster taxa reveals that survival alone is only part of the picture. Endurance allows a lineage to remain, opportunity allows it to spread. In the wake of Earth's greatest extinction, a small collection of adaptable organisms inherited a world emptied of many former rulers, and for a time, they became the most successful creatures on the planet. If a traveler could have wandered across the recovering landscapes of the early Triassic, one animal would have appeared again and again with almost unsettling regularity. In river valleys, on open floodplains, along the margins of sparse vegetation, the same sturdy figure would have emerged from the dust. Its success became so overwhelming that for a time, much of the terrestrial fossil record seemed to belong to it alone. That animal was Lystrosaurus. Lystrosaurus belonged to a group called Dicynodont therapsids, distant relatives of the lineage that would eventually produce mammals. It was not especially large, roughly comparable in size to a modern German shepherd, though its proportions were unlike anything alive today. A broad barrel shaped torso rested on short, powerful limbs. Its head ended in a blunt, downward curving snout, flanked by a pair of modest tusks that projected from the upper jaw. The mouth of Lystrosaurus reveals much about how it lived. Instead of front teeth, it possessed a sharp beak, similar in function to that of a tortoise. This structure allowed it to clip hardy vegetation close to the ground. Behind the beak, there were no chewing teeth, capable of processing food in the mammalian sense. Tough plant material was gathered, swallowed, and handled largely within the digestive system itself. It was a simple approach, but simplicity can become a powerful advantage when resources are limited. Before the Great Dying, Lystrosaurus was only one member of a much larger community. Fossils from late Permian rocks show that it existed across broad portions of Pangaea, yet it was far from dominant. Many other herbivores shared the landscape. Numerous ecological roles were already occupied. Nothing about its early history suggested that it would become one of the most successful vertebrates in Earth's history. Then the world changed. In sediments deposited after the extinction, Lystrosaurus appears in extraordinary abundance. Some fossil assemblages contain little else. Paleontologists studying these deposits often encounter skeleton after skeleton belonging to the same genus. Estimates suggest that nearly 90% of land vertebrates in some regions may have been Lystrosaurus. Such dominance is almost without parallel among large terrestrial animals. Its geographic reach was equally remarkable. Fossils have been discovered in South Africa, Russia, China, India, Mongolia, and Antarctica. Few land vertebrates have ever achieved such a distribution. This widespread presence hints at a creature capable of tolerating a broad range of environmental conditions during one of the most unstable periods in planetary history. Several traits likely contributed to this success. Lystrosaurus appears to have been an undemanding feeder, capable of surviving on vegetation that other herbivores might have ignored. Evidence also suggests an ability to withstand substantial temperature variation. Burrowing behavior may have provided additional protection from harsh surface conditions, offering access to more stable microenvironments. When the surrounding world became difficult to endure, its bones reveal another useful characteristic. Histological studies indicate rapid growth and relatively early reproduction. In ecosystems where mortality was high and conditions unpredictable, reaching maturity quickly could make the difference between persistence and disappearance. The early Triassic descendants of Lystrosaurus also became smaller than many of their Permian predecessors, an example of the phenomenon known as the Lilliput effect. Reduced body size lowered resource demands and may have improved survival under environmental stress. There was nothing extravagant about Lystrosaurus. It possessed no spectacular weapons, no exceptional speed, and no obvious grandeur. Yet when countless specialists vanished, the ordinary qualities of flexibility, resilience, and practicality proved enough to carry it through. Beneath the visible landscape of the early Triassic existed a second world, hidden from the sky and separated from the surface by only a thin layer of soil. It was dark, cramped, and often damp. There was little room to move and little to eat. Yet for many animals living through the aftermath of Earth's greatest extinction, this unseen realm became one of the safest places available. The value of a burrow lies not in luxury, but in moderation. Conditions below ground change more slowly than conditions above it. Temperature swings become muted. Moisture lingers longer. Air quality can remain comparatively stable. During ordinary periods of Earth's history, these advantages are useful. During a planetary crisis, they can become life preserving. The surface environments of Pangaea were increasingly difficult places to inhabit. Seasonal extremes intensified. Vegetation became sparse across many regions. Soil systems that had supported complex ecosystems for millions of years were disrupted. Organisms faced an unpredictable world where exposure itself carried growing risks. A few meters beneath the ground, however, many of those fluctuations became less severe. Evidence for the importance of this strategy is preserved in remarkable detail within the rocks of South Africa's Karoo Basin. There, paleontologists have discovered abundant fossilized burrow structures dating to the period immediately following the extinction. These traces become noticeably more common in layers formed after the crisis than in those deposited beforehand. The change is striking enough that it has drawn sustained scientific attention for decades. Unlike bones alone, burrows record behavior. They preserve actions rather than anatomy. Each tunnel represents a decision made by an animal responding to its surroundings. When large numbers of such structures appear together in the geological record, they offer a glimpse into how entire communities adjusted to changing conditions. The increase in burrow abundance suggests that many survivors adopted similar solutions when confronted with environmental instability. Lystrosaurus appears prominently within this story. Several lines of evidence indicate that it spent at least part of its life underground. The powerful limbs and sturdy body that served it well in other ways may also have assisted in excavation, yet it was not alone. Small procolophonids likely sought shelter beneath the surface. Early cynodonts did the same. Across unrelated groups, the pattern repeats with remarkable consistency. This convergence is particularly revealing because these animals were not closely connected evolutionarily. They arrived at similar behaviors independently. Such repeated solutions often indicate strong environmental pressures. When different lineages respond in comparable ways, it suggests that certain strategies offered genuine advantages in the world they inhabited. Life underground also brought secondary benefits. Burrows reduced exposure to predators. They conserved moisture in drying climates. They provided protected spaces for resting, reproducing, and raising young. Even temporary shelter during periods of environmental stress could improve the chances of survival. What emerges from the fossil evidence is not a story of dominance or conquest, it is a story of refuge. The animals that dug into the earth were not escaping toward abundance. They were seeking pockets of consistency in a world that offered very little of it. For many survivors of the Great Dying, the difference between persistence and disappearance may have been measured not in strength or intelligence, but in the simple ability to move downward and wait within the quiet stability of the ground. Among the scattered survivors of the Great Dying lived a small creature whose importance far exceeded its size. It did not dominate landscapes or spread across continents in overwhelming numbers. Its significance lay elsewhere, hidden within its anatomy and preserved in a series of fossils so intimate that they seem to capture moments of life rather than mere remains. This animal was Thrinaxodon. Thrinaxodon belonged to a group known as the Cynodonts, a branch of therapsids positioned remarkably close to the ancestry of mammals. When paleontologists trace the long pathway leading from ancient synapsids to modern mammals, cynodonts occupy a crucial stretch of that journey. They were not mammals themselves, yet many of the features associated with mammalian life were already beginning to emerge within their bodies. Roughly the size of a modern fox, Thrinaxodon possessed proportions that distinguished it from many other animals of its time. Its limbs were positioned more directly beneath the body, rather than extending outward to the sides. This arrangement supported a more efficient style of movement and reduced the energy required for locomotion. It represented an important step toward the body plan that would later become characteristic of mammals. Its skull offers additional clues. Small openings and pits in the bones of the snout suggest the presence of whiskers, sensory structures capable of detecting subtle movements and textures. In narrow tunnels where visibility was limited, such adaptations would have provided valuable information about the surrounding environment. Long before true mammals appeared, the foundations of mammalian sensory systems were already taking shape. Evidence preserved within the microscopic structure of Thrinaxodon bones reveals another intriguing characteristic. Growth patterns indicate rapid development compared with many contemporary reptiles. Some researchers interpret this as evidence that Thrinaxodon possessed an elevated metabolism and may have been partially warm-blooded. Such physiology would have allowed greater activity across a wider range of environmental conditions, particularly during periods when colder temperatures might have restricted less metabolically active animals. Its most remarkable adaptation may have been behavioral. Thrinaxodon appears to have entered prolonged periods of dormancy through a process similar to modern aestivation. During these intervals, metabolic activity slowed dramatically, energy consumption decreased. In landscapes where food resources could become scarce for extended periods, such a strategy offered a practical means of enduring hardship without constant foraging. The fossil record preserves this behavior with unusual clarity. Numerous Thrinaxodon specimens have been discovered within ancient burrows, their bodies curled tightly into resting positions. These postures resemble sleep frozen in stone, preserved across roughly 250 million years. Few fossils provide such a direct glimpse into how an extinct animal may have spent its final moments. One discovery from South Africa's Karoo Basin is particularly extraordinary. Advanced synchrotron imaging revealed a Thrinaxodon occupying a burrow alongside Brumastega, an amphibian bearing partially healed rib injuries. At some point, The wounded animal entered the shelter, while the Thrinaxodon remained in deep torpor. Both stayed there together. There is no sign of struggle or predation, only a brief and accidental coexistence preserved by geological time. The lineage to which Thrinaxodon belonged continued long after many contemporaries disappeared. Across the Triassic, cynodonts diversified into new forms and explored new ecological opportunities. Over tens of millions of years, their descendants moved steadily toward true mammalian characteristics, carrying forward traits that had already begun to appear in this small survivor resting quietly beneath the ground. Not every consequence of the Great Dying can be measured by what disappeared. Some of its most revealing traces are found in what remained, preserved not as absence but as reduction. Across the rocks of the early Triassic, paleontologists began noticing a curious pattern. The survivors were often smaller than their ancestors. Entire lineages seemed to have contracted, as though the biological world had quietly tightened itself in response to catastrophe. This phenomenon is known as the Lilliput effect, a term borrowed from the tiny inhabitants of Jonathan Swift's fictional land of Lilliput. In paleontology, it describes a widespread decrease in body size following major extinction events. The pattern has been documented after several biological crises, but nowhere is it more striking than in the aftermath of the Great Dying. The evidence appears repeatedly across unrelated groups. Lystrosaurus populations of the early Triassic were generally smaller than many of their Permian predecessors. Similar trends are visible among therocephalians and cynodonts. The same pattern extends beyond land. Marine organisms that survived the extinction, including shellfish, ammonoids, and certain fish lineages, frequently appear in reduced forms compared with earlier relatives. The consistency of this trend suggests that a common set of pressures was influencing life across the planet. Scientists continue to debate the precise mechanisms responsible. One possibility is that smaller individuals within species simply had a higher chance of surviving the environmental crisis. If larger members of a population required more food and energy, they may have been disproportionately vulnerable during periods of scarcity. Over time, the survivors would leave behind descendants descended primarily from smaller ancestors. Another possibility involves evolutionary change occurring after the extinction itself. Under conditions of limited resources and persistent environmental instability, natural selection may have favored reduced body size. In this scenario, populations gradually evolved towards smaller forms because those individuals reproduced more successfully in a demanding world. The advantages of being small become easier to appreciate when viewed through the realities of the early Triassic. Smaller animals require less food to maintain their bodies. They can often reach maturity more quickly and produce offspring sooner. In warmer climates, excess heat is shed more efficiently. Smaller bodies also provide access to refuges unavailable to larger creatures, whether narrow crevices, sheltered cavities, or underground tunnels. Body size, therefore, became more than a physical characteristic. It became part of a survival strategy. The extinction was not merely filtering species, it was filtering forms within those species, favoring particular combinations of traits suited to altered conditions. Evolution was operating not only on who survived, but on what shape survival itself would take. The result was a world temporarily dominated by modest proportions. Large animals still existed, but they were far less common than before. Communities across land and sea became populated by organisms that occupied less space, consumed fewer resources, and reproduced with greater urgency. recovery did not begin with giants reclaiming lost ecosystems. It began with compact survivors making use of whatever opportunities remained. For a period measured in millions of years, the living world became noticeably smaller. Yet this reduction was not a sign of weakness or decline. It reflected a subtle adjustment to circumstances unlike anything most species had ever faced. In the wake of immense loss, smallness became one of life's most effective tools for persistence. Far below the recovering landscapes of the early Triassic, another struggle for survival was unfolding across the seafloor. The oceans that remained after the Great Dying were profoundly altered places. Many long-established communities had vanished. Vast regions supported only a fraction of their former diversity. Yet within these diminished ecosystems, a modest shell-bearing animal began an extraordinary rise. Its name was Claria. Claria belonged to the bivalves, the group that today includes clams, oysters, mussels, and scallops. Physically, it was not an imposing creature. Most individuals were small enough to fit comfortably within a human hand. Their shells were thin and lightly ribbed, giving them an appearance that was simple rather than spectacular. Nothing about their form suggested they would become one of the defining organisms of the post-extinction oceans. Before the catastrophe, Claria occupied a relatively minor place within marine ecosystems. More dominant groups controlled much of the seafloor. Among the most successful were the brachiopods, filter-feeding animals whose abundance had shaped marine communities for immense spans of geological time. They existed in extraordinary diversity and occupied ecological roles across vast regions of the ancient oceans. The extinction altered that balance with remarkable speed. Brachiopod diversity collapsed dramatically, leaving behind ecological vacancies on a scale rarely seen in marine history. As many established competitors disappeared, Claria expanded into habitats that had once been crowded with other organisms. Its fossils began appearing in astonishing numbers within rocks deposited immediately after the extinction boundary. What makes this expansion particularly remarkable is its geographic scope. Claria fossils have been recovered from sites spread across China, Italy, Greenland, and Arctic regions, among many others. Such a distribution indicates that the genus occupied an immense range during the early Triassic. For a time, it became one of the most widespread marine organisms on Earth. Its success appears closely linked to a trait that would have been invaluable in post-extinction oceans. Claria could tolerate extremely low oxygen concentrations. Many marine animals struggled when oxygen levels declined, but Claria possessed a physiology that allowed it to persist under conditions that proved fatal to countless others. In effect, it was already equipped for an environment that had become hostile to much of marine life. Mobility likely contributed as well. Unlike many organisms anchored permanently to a single location, Claria could move across the seafloor. The distances involved were modest, yet even limited mobility provided flexibility. When local conditions deteriorated, movement offered opportunities unavailable to more sedentary species. In unstable ecosystems, such adaptability carried considerable value. As populations expanded, new species of Claria emerged and spread into different ecological roles. The process occurred rapidly by geological standards. In ocean basins still marked by reduced biodiversity, Claria became one of the principal occupants of available space. Its rise closely parallels the success of certain terrestrial survivors, demonstrating that similar patterns unfolded both on land and beneath the sea. The dominance of Claria persisted for roughly 2 million years. During that interval, marine ecosystems remained comparatively simple, with a handful of successful survivors exerting an influence far greater than would have been possible before the extinction. Only gradually did more diverse communities begin to return. For a significant chapter of Earth's recovery, the oceans belonged not to giants or ancient rulers, but to a small bivalve whose greatest strength was its ability to endure conditions that others could not. Not all marine survivors followed the same path. While some flourished across broad stretches of seafloor, others endured in scattered refuges, lingering in corners of the ocean where conditions remained just stable enough to support life. Their stories reveal a recovery that was neither uniform nor simple. Instead, it unfolded through a patchwork of survivors, each carrying different advantages into a transformed world. Among the most remarkable were the ammonoids. These animals, distant relatives of modern nautiluses and squids, spent their lives drifting and swimming through ancient seas within elegantly coiled shells. Before the extinction, ammonoids were diverse and widespread. Then came a collapse so severe that nearly the entire group vanished. Evidence suggests that only one, or perhaps two, surviving lineages crossed the boundary into the Triassic. Ordinarily, such a narrow survival would seem to mark the beginning of a slow decline. Yet ammonoids responded in exactly the opposite way. Within roughly 1 to 2 million years, their descendants expanded into hundreds of species. New shell forms appeared, new ecological roles emerged. They spread through different depths and habitats with extraordinary speed. Paleontologists often describe this diversification as one of the most rapid evolutionary radiations known from the fossil record. Among the most successful descendants were the ceratitids, whose distinctive shells would become familiar features of Triassic oceans for millions of years. Another survivor followed a far quieter strategy. Lingula, a small brachiopod, had already existed for an immense span of geological time before the Great Dying occurred. Unlike many of its relatives, Lingula built its shell primarily from organophosphate minerals rather than calcium carbonate. This distinction proved important, as changing ocean chemistry made carbonate shells increasingly difficult to maintain. Lingula's alternative construction offered protection against pressures that devastated many other brachiopods. The survival of Lingula carries an almost timeless quality. Fossils from the distant Cambrian already resemble the living animals found today. Across approximately 500 million years, the basic design changed remarkably little. Rather than continually reinventing itself, Lingula persisted through durability and environmental tolerance, quietly enduring crises that eliminated countless other lineages. Far below the surface, certain fish discovered opportunities in deeper waters. Conditions there were not ideal, yet they could be more stable than the disrupted environments above. Cooler temperatures and reduced fluctuations offered temporary refuge. Some lineages appear to have survived by occupying these deeper habitats until broader marine ecosystems slowly recovered. Conodonts also endured. These slender, eel-like animals possessed complex mineralized feeding structures, often referred to as teeth. They survived the extinction and experienced a brief resurgence during the early Triassic. For a time, they flourished within recovering ecosystems before eventually disappearing much later during the Mesozoic era. Other survivors included early shrimps and certain sponge groups. Their fossil record suggests persistence within isolated pockets where local conditions remained habitable. Such refuges were scattered and often temporary, yet they provided enough stability for populations to continue. Viewed together, These survivors reveal a recurring pattern. Many were relatively small. Many tolerated low oxygen conditions better than their contemporaries. Several possessed flexible diets or lifestyles. Others carried biological traits that happened to match the altered chemistry of post extinction oceans. No single strategy guaranteed success. Instead, survival emerged through a collection of advantages that allowed different organisms to endure where countless others could not, preserving fragile threads of marine life through one of Earth's darkest intervals. Modern oceans are mosaics of difference. Tropical reefs host creatures that never appear in polar waters. Deep basins support communities distinct from those of shallow continental shelves. Geography, climate, currents, and millions of years of local evolution create marine ecosystems with unique identities. Yet, for a remarkable interval after the Great Dying, much of that individuality vanished. Paleontologists studying rocks from the early Triassic noticed something unusual. Fossils collected from locations separated by enormous distances often contained strikingly similar communities. Species that appeared in one region frequently appeared in another thousands of kilometers away. Assemblages from different latitudes and ocean basins seemed to echo one another with unexpected consistency. Before the extinction, such uniformity was uncommon. Different marine provinces supported different dominant organisms. Evolution, operating in relative isolation, produced regional variations that gave each oceanic setting its own character. Distinct combinations of species occupied separate environments, creating a patchwork of biological diversity across the globe. After the extinction, that pattern changed dramatically. Fossil beds from widely separated regions repeatedly contain many of the same survivors. Chloria appears across vast stretches of the ancient world. Certain ammonoids occur in multiple marine basins. A limited collection of gastropods and other resilient organisms spread with unusual success. Whether examining deposits from equatorial settings or much higher latitudes, researchers encounter many of the same names again and again. Scientists refer to this interval as the Great Dulling. The term captures a reduction not merely in diversity, but in ecological distinctiveness. Oceans that once displayed regional personalities became increasingly alike. The variation that had characterized marine ecosystems before the extinction was replaced by a more homogeneous biological landscape. Recent research has provided insight into how such a transformation may have occurred. A study published by researchers at Stanford in 2025 explored the consequences of extreme biodiversity loss on marine ecosystems. Their models suggest that when diversity collapses to very low levels, surviving species encounter far fewer obstacles to expansion. Competitors disappear, predators vanish, ecological boundaries weaken. Opportunities that would once have been contested become widely available. In such circumstances, adaptable organisms can spread with remarkable efficiency. Species capable of tolerating varied conditions expand into regions previously occupied by specialized local communities. Instead of many organisms sharing ecological space, a relatively small number of survivors begin occupying similar roles across vast geographic areas. The result is a world where biological repetition replaces biological variety. The duration of this phenomenon makes it especially striking. Evidence suggests that the Great Dulling persisted for approximately 5 million years. In ecological terms, this is an immense span of time. Entire evolutionary experiments could begin and end within such an interval. Yet, for millions of years, marine ecosystems remained simplified and unusually uniform. Eventually, the pattern began to fade. New species emerged. Regional differences slowly reappeared. Evolution generated fresh combinations of organisms adapted to local conditions. Gradually, the oceans recovered some of the diversity and individuality they had lost. The Great Dulling remains one of the most unusual chapters in the history of marine life. It represents a period when survival itself became so selective that only a narrow collection of successful forms remained. For millions of years, oceans separated by vast distances shared many of the same inhabitants, creating a level of biological similarity unmatched elsewhere in the fossil record. The seas endured, but much of their uniqueness had temporarily disappeared. Few groups of animals possess a reputation for endurance equal to that of insects. Across hundreds of millions of years, they persisted through changing climates, shifting continents, and multiple extinction events that reshaped life on Earth. Their history is so successful that insects are often viewed as nearly untouchable by planetary catastrophe, yet the Great Dying reached even them. Among all known mass extinctions, the Permian catastrophe stands alone in its impact on insects. Fossil evidence indicates that approximately 1 in 3 insect families disappeared. Entire lineages vanished from the record. For a group that had weathered previous biological crises with comparatively little disruption, the losses were extraordinary. No other extinction event is known to have affected insects so severely. Even so, complete collapse never occurred. A number of insect groups survived and eventually became important participants in the rebuilding of terrestrial ecosystems. Among the most successful were early beetles, cockroach relatives, and certain fly lineages. Their persistence reflects many of the same themes already visible among other survivors. Small body size reduced resource requirements. Rapid reproductive cycles allowed populations to recover quickly. Flexible feeding habits enabled them to exploit whatever food sources remained available. These characteristics became particularly valuable in landscapes overwhelmed by ecological disruption. The extinction left behind immense quantities of dead organic matter. Forests had declined. Plant communities were altered. Countless organisms had perished. Across broad regions, the land contained vast stores of biological material awaiting decomposition. This is where surviving insects played one of their most important roles. Many functioned as detritivores and decomposers, feeding on decaying organic matter and helping return nutrients to the environment. Their activities accelerated processes that would otherwise have proceeded much more slowly. By breaking down dead material, they contributed to the gradual restoration of soil systems and nutrient cycles upon which future ecosystems depended. Without these recycling processes, recovery would have faced additional obstacles. Nutrients trapped within accumulated organic remains are of limited use to living communities. Decomposition releases those materials back into circulation, making them available once again to plants, microbes, and animals. In this sense, insects helped maintain some of the most fundamental biological functions operating on land. Yet there is evidence that even these recycling systems were initially overwhelmed. In many early Triassic deposits, paleontologists observe what is known as the fungal spike. Layers of sediment become unusually rich in fungal spores, suggesting that fungi and microbial communities expanded dramatically in the immediate aftermath of the extinction. For a brief interval, decomposers operating at microscopic scales appear to have dominated processes that larger organisms had previously shared. The fungal spike offers an unusual glimpse into a world temporarily simplified. Rather than complex food webs driving the recycling of nutrients, basic microbial and fungal systems carried much of the burden. Their expansion reflects how profoundly ecological structures had been disrupted. When larger communities collapsed, simpler organisms stepped forward to perform essential functions. Eventually, insect populations recovered and resumed broader ecological roles. Their return added complexity and efficiency to terrestrial nutrient cycling. Beetles, cockroach relatives, flies, and countless other survivors became participants in rebuilding environments that had been stripped to their foundations. The story of insect survival is not merely one of persistence, it is also a story of maintenance. While larger animals often attract attention in discussions of extinction and recovery, insects help sustain the underlying processes that allowed ecosystems to function at all. In the long aftermath of the Great Dying, some of Earth's smallest survivors became essential architects of renewal. Long after many animals had disappeared from the fossil record, the land faced another challenge that was less visible but equally important. A terrestrial ecosystem cannot exist without its foundation. Every herbivore depends upon plants. Every predator depends, directly or indirectly, upon those herbivores. When vegetation collapses, the consequences spread outward through every layer of life. The Great Dying struck plant communities with tremendous force. Across much of Pangaea, forests that had flourished for millions of years declined or vanished entirely. Among the most heavily affected were the seed ferns that had once dominated extensive regions of the supercontinent. Their disappearance transformed landscapes that had previously supported complex ecological networks. What remained was a patchwork of damaged environments, struggling to regain biological stability. Yet complete botanical collapse never occurred. Certain groups endured where others failed. Conifers survived, ferns survived, lycopsids survived. These plants shared characteristics that proved useful in a world marked by disturbed soils, unstable climates, and limited nutrients. They were not necessarily the most dominant species before the extinction, but they possessed forms of resilience that became increasingly valuable afterward. Among these survivors, ferns occupy a particularly important place in the geological record. In sediments deposited immediately above the extinction boundary, scientists often encounter enormous quantities of fern spores. This pattern is so widespread and consistent that it has earned its own name, the fern spike. It appears on multiple continents and serves as one of the clearest indicators of ecological disruption associated with the Great Dying. The significance of the fern spike lies in what it reveals about recovery. Ferns reproduce through spores that can disperse widely and establish new populations rapidly. They are often among the first plants to colonize disturbed environments. Following the collapse of larger plant communities, ferns expanded into newly available spaces with remarkable speed. Their spores accumulated in such abundance that they left a visible signal preserved within ancient rocks. Conifers followed a different path. Equipped with needle-like leaves that reduced water loss, they were well suited to challenging environmental conditions. Many could tolerate poor soils and variable climates better than more specialized plants. Rather than expanding explosively, conifers spread gradually across recovering landscapes, becoming important components of the vegetation that would define much of the Triassic world. Not all botanical groups were so fortunate. One of the most significant losses involved Glossopteris, a distinctive seed plant that had dominated large portions of southern Pangaea. For millions of years, Glossopteris formed extensive forests and played a major ecological role. Its decline and near disappearance mark one of the defining botanical consequences of the extinction. Entire ecosystems built around its presence were forced to reorganize without it. The importance of plant survival extends far beyond the plants themselves. Vegetation forms the energetic foundation of terrestrial food webs. Without primary producers capturing sunlight and converting it into biological matter, larger ecosystems cannot function. Herbivores require plants, predators require herbivores. Every level depends upon the one below it. For this reason, the recovery of plant diversity proceeded slowly and carried enormous significance. While some animal groups began diversifying relatively quickly, botanical communities required far longer to regain their former complexity. Rebuilding the base of an ecosystem is a gradual process. The survivors that endured were not merely participants in recovery. They were the living framework upon which the terrestrial world would eventually be rebuilt. History often remembers the dominant creatures of an age. Giant predators leave dramatic skeletons. Massive herbivores reshape entire landscapes. Yet, in the aftermath of the Great Dying, some of the most successful survivors were animals that rarely attract attention. Among them were the procolophonids, small reptiles whose persistence helped sustain terrestrial ecosystems during one of the most difficult chapters in Earth's history. At first glance, a procolophonid might appear familiar. Its body was compact and low to the ground. Its proportions resembled those of a sturdy lizard. The skull was broad and triangular, giving the animal a distinctive silhouette when viewed from above. Along its jaws sat rows of peg-like teeth, well suited for crushing and processing resistant plant material. Despite this superficial resemblance to modern lizards, procolophonids belonged to a very different branch of reptilian evolution. They were not close relatives of the lizards and snakes that inhabit the world today. Instead, they occupied a separate lineage, one that appears more closely connected to the ancestry of turtles. Their appearance illustrates a recurring pattern in evolution, where unrelated groups sometimes arrive at similar body forms while following entirely different evolutionary paths. The environments inherited by procolophonids after the extinction offered few luxuries. Vegetation was often sparse and of poor quality. Ecological networks remained simplified. Many of the large herbivores that had once dominated terrestrial food webs were gone. In such conditions, survival favored creatures capable of making use of limited resources. Procolophonids possessed several advantages. Their small size reduced the amount of food required to sustain them. A large animal must gather substantial energy each day merely to maintain its body. Smaller animals operate under different constraints. They can persist on resources that would be insufficient for larger competitors. In a recovery world where abundance was rare, this difference mattered enormously. Their teeth also reveal clues about their success. Rather than specializing on a narrow range of foods, procolophonids appear capable of processing tough, low-quality vegetation. The recovering landscapes of the early Triassic were not covered in rich forests. Much of the available plant material was hardy, fibrous, and nutritionally modest. Animals able to utilize such resources possessed an immediate advantage. Evidence also suggests that many procolophonids spent time underground. Burrowing provided protection from environmental instability and offered access to more consistent conditions than those found on the surface. By combining a modest body size with sheltering behavior and a flexible diet, they assembled a survival strategy remarkably well suited to the challenges of the age. As ecosystems slowly expanded, procolophonids diversified and became common components of terrestrial communities. They occupied roles once held by a wider variety of herbivorous animals. Though never among the largest inhabitants of the Triassic world, they contributed to rebuilding ecological structure from the ground upward. Their success, however, was not permanent. Procolophonids survived the extinction and persisted for approximately 50 million years afterward, yet they eventually disappeared by the close of the Triassic. New groups emerged. Ecosystems became more complex. Evolution continued reshaping the world, and the advantages that once favored procolophonids gradually became less significant. Their story offers a subtle lesson about survival. Enduring a catastrophe does not guarantee eternal success. Some lineages survive only long enough to bridge one world to the next. The procolophonids inherited a damaged planet, helped occupy the spaces left vacant by extinction, and then quietly stepped aside as Earth's story continued unfolding around them. Some evolutionary revolutions begin quietly. They do not announce themselves with towering bodies or overwhelming numbers. Instead, they begin with small populations moving through the margins of a changing world, carrying traits whose importance will only become apparent much later. In the aftermath of the Great Dying, one such group was already present, scattered across recovering landscapes, largely unnoticed beside the more familiar survivors. These animals were the archosauromorphs. During the Permian, archosauromorphs occupied a relatively modest position within terrestrial ecosystems. The world was dominated by therapsids, the mammal-like animals that filled many of the largest herbivore and predator roles. Against such established competitors, the early archosauromorphs appeared unremarkable. Most were small. None hinted at the extraordinary future hidden within their lineage. Yet their anatomy possessed several advantages suited to the conditions emerging after the extinction. Their bodies were generally lighter than those of many contemporaries. Their limbs and skeletal structure allowed more efficient movement. Rather than relying entirely on sprawling postures common among numerous earlier reptiles, many archosauromorphs exhibited body plans that supported greater endurance and mobility. In a stable ecosystem, such differences might have remained relatively minor. The early Triassic was anything but stable. Food resources could be widely dispersed. Suitable habitats were often fragmented. Animals frequently needed to travel greater distances in search of nourishment or shelter. Under these circumstances, efficiency became increasingly valuable. A creature capable of moving farther while expending less energy possessed an important advantage. Among the earliest successful representatives were the Protorasuchians. These reptiles were long-bodied predators, often compared in appearance to crocodiles, though they belonged to a much earlier chapter of reptilian evolution. Fossils suggest they commonly inhabited environments associated with rivers and water sources where surviving prey could still be found. In landscapes where predator diversity had collapsed, Protorasuchians became some of the most visible hunters of the recovery period. What makes the Archosauromorph story remarkable is not merely that they survived, it is what survival allowed them to become. Over the course of the Triassic, their descendants diversified at an extraordinary pace. Evolution explored new body plans, new ecological roles, and new ways of life. One branch eventually produced the ancestors of modern crocodilians. Another gave rise to pterosaurs, the first vertebrates to achieve powered flight. A third lineage would transform Earth's ecosystems more profoundly than almost any other group in history. That lineage became the dinosaurs. The Great Dying did not directly create dinosaurs. Their appearance required millions of years of subsequent evolution. Yet the extinction reshaped the competitive landscape in ways that made their rise possible. Before the catastrophe, dominant therapsid herbivores and predators occupied many of the ecological positions that later dinosaurs would inherit. After those communities collapsed, opportunities emerged that had not previously existed. Evolution rarely leaves empty spaces unfilled. As ecosystems slowly rebuilt, archosaurs expanded into niches that had once belonged to other groups. Their anatomical advantages, combined with the absence of former competitors, allowed them to establish increasingly influential positions within terrestrial environments. The consequences extended far beyond the early Triassic. From these modest survivors emerged animals that would dominate land ecosystems for approximately 165 million years. The extinction did more than remove species. It reorganized the architecture of life itself. Within that reorganization, the foundations of the dinosaur age were quietly taking shape. There are places on Earth where time seems unusually visible. Layers of stone accumulate one upon another, preserving fragments of vanished worlds with such clarity that entire chapters of planetary history remain readable hundreds of millions of years later. Among the most important of these places is the Karoo Basin of South Africa, a landscape whose rocks contain one of the most complete records of the Great Dying ever discovered on land. The Karoo is vast, stretching across large portions of southern Africa, over immense spans of time. Rivers, floodplains, and ancient environments deposited sediments that gradually hardened into stone. Because these layers accumulated with relatively little interruption, they preserve an unusually continuous timeline across the Permian and Triassic periods. For paleontologists, this continuity is invaluable. Few locations allow scientists to examine the extinction and its aftermath with such detail. The lower layers reveal a thriving world. Fossils from late Permian rocks record a remarkable diversity of life. Numerous therapsid species inhabited the landscape. Predatory gorgonopsians occupied the role of dominant hunters. Decinodont herbivores occurred in many forms and sizes. Amphibians flourished in freshwater environments. The ecosystem appears varied, complex, and well established, reflecting millions of years of evolutionary history. Then the record changes. Moving upward through the rock sequence, paleontologists encounter a dramatic decline in diversity. Species that appeared frequently below the boundary become rare or vanish entirely. Geological time can often blur biological transitions, but in the Karoo, the shift is striking. Rich communities give way to a much simpler world. The fossil assemblages become increasingly dominated by a small number of survivors, particularly Lystrosaurus. This transformation provides one of the clearest terrestrial records of mass extinction ever identified. Researchers have examined approximately 8,600 fossil specimens spanning this interval, creating the largest data set available for studying any extinction event on land. The sheer volume of evidence allows patterns to emerge with unusual confidence. The Karoo does not merely suggest ecological collapse, it documents it in extraordinary detail. Among its most important discoveries are the fossilized traces of underground life. Preserved within the rocks are numerous burrow casts, physical records of tunnels excavated by ancient animals. These structures provide rare behavioral evidence, capturing actions rather than simply anatomy. Many of the burrows contain the remains of their occupants, preserved in curled resting postures that suggest periods of dormancy or sheltering. One particular discovery has become especially famous. Within a fossilized burrow, researchers found the remains of Thrinaxodon alongside an injured amphibian called Brumistega. Advanced synchrotron imaging later revealed details hidden inside the stone, allowing scientists to reconstruct the unusual scene. The two animals, belonging to entirely different lineages, had occupied the same confined refuge during a time of profound environmental stress. The significance of the karoo extends beyond any single fossil. It preserves an entire transition between worlds. Within its rocks are records of flourishing ecosystems, sudden decline, survival strategies, and the earliest stages of recovery. Few places capture so completely the moment when life came closest to losing its hold on the planet. Today, the basin appears quiet, shaped by wind, erosion, and open horizons. Yet beneath its surface lies an archive unlike any other. Every layer records lives interrupted, lives preserved, and lives that somehow continued. The Karoo remains one of Earth's most remarkable witnesses to extinction and endurance, a landscape where deep time still speaks through stone. Imagine arriving not at the moment of disaster, but after it. The eruptions continue far away on the horizon. The extinction has already swept across the planet. The Great Collapse is no longer an event. It has become the environment itself. This was the world inherited by the survivors of the early Triassic, a place that would have felt profoundly unfamiliar even to the creatures that managed to endure it. The sky was likely one of the first things an observer would notice. For thousands of years, volcanic aerosols and atmospheric pollutants may have lingered overhead, scattering sunlight before it reached the surface. Days were probably illuminated by a muted glow rather than a clear brilliance. The sun still rose and set, but its light may have seemed softened, filtered through layers of particles suspended high above the world. Below that dimmed sky stretched landscapes dominated by exposed sediments. Geological deposits from the period frequently display extensive red and gray coloration, evidence of oxidized soils and disturbed environmental conditions. These surfaces were often nutrient poor and heavily weathered. Vegetation persisted, but it did so unevenly. Hardy ferns and resilient conifers occupied patches of land where more demanding plant communities could no longer thrive. Temperature added another layer of difficulty. Climate models and geological evidence suggest that some equatorial regions may have experienced surface temperatures exceeding 50 to 60 degrees Celsius. Such conditions approach the limits of what large terrestrial animals can tolerate. Vast stretches of tropical terrain may have become biological dead zones, regions where sustained occupation by larger vertebrates was effectively impossible. Waterways offered little stability. The disappearance of extensive forests had altered the movement of water across the land. Deep root systems that once slowed runoff were greatly reduced. Rainfall that had previously been absorbed into vegetation and soil now moved rapidly across exposed surfaces. Rivers became unpredictable, vulnerable to sudden flooding and surges carrying sediment, ash, and chemically altered runoff into downstream environments. The oceans were no less transformed. Surface waters were unusually warm and often depleted in oxygen. In some regions, anaerobic microorganisms flourished under these stressed conditions. Their activity may have contributed to occasional releases of hydrogen sulfide, a toxic gas capable of affecting marine ecosystems on a large scale. Geological and chemical evidence suggests that bacterial blooms sometimes spread through portions of the ocean, tinting waters with unusual green hues and reflecting the altered chemistry of the post-extinction seas. Yet perhaps the most striking characteristic of the early Triassic world was not visual at all. It was acoustic. The Permian had supported rich and diverse ecosystems, filled with countless interactions among animals. After the extinction, much of that complexity vanished. Fewer species meant fewer voices. Across many landscapes, Sounds that had once formed the background texture of life simply no longer existed. Wind crossing open ground, rain striking exposed sediment, water moving through unstable channels. Occasionally, distant geological unrest. Beyond these, there may have been long intervals of relative quiet. This was not a world rebuilt, it was a world suspended between collapse and recovery. The organisms that remained were not flourishing in the way thriving ecosystems flourish. They persisted because certain traits allowed persistence. Every surviving lineage occupied an environment defined by scarcity, instability, and continual pressure. Life continued, but it did so within conditions that pushed survival close to its limits. Some stories are measured not only by what happened, but by how long their consequences remained behind. The Great Dying presents one of the starkest examples in the history of life. The catastrophe itself unfolded with terrifying speed in geological terms, yet the return of complexity moved at a pace so slow that entire chapters of Earth's history passed before the wounds began to close. Evidence gathered from rock layers around the world suggests that the most intense pulse of extinction may have occurred within roughly 60,000 years. Some models narrow that interval even further, proposing a peak crisis lasting perhaps only 10,000 to 20,000 years. On the scale of geological time, such a span is almost instantaneous. Species that had persisted through millions of years of environmental change disappeared within a window shorter than the lifespan of many mountain ranges. What vanished was not simply a collection of organisms. Entire networks of relationships collapsed alongside them. Predators lost prey, herbivores lost food sources, reef builders vanished from the seas. Pollinators, decomposers, grazers, scavengers, filter feeders, all were reduced or removed. The living architecture that connected ecosystems across land and ocean fractured in thousands of places at once. The remarkable part of the story is what followed. Recovery did not arrive quickly. It did not sweep across the planet in a single wave of renewal. Instead, it advanced unevenly, hesitantly, and often stalled altogether. Scientists estimate that between 5 and 10 million years were required before ecosystems once again approached the complexity that existed before the extinction. For countless generations of surviving organisms, the crisis was not an event from the past, it remained the world they inhabited. This duration becomes even more striking when compared with other mass extinctions. Previous biological crises had often been followed by recoveries measured in 1 to 2 million years. The aftermath of the Great Dying stretched far beyond that pattern. The difference suggests that the extinction had damaged not merely species diversity, but the ecological foundations upon which diversity depends. Rebuilding those foundations proved far more difficult than preserving them had been. Few examples illustrate this better than coral reefs. Before the extinction, reefs supported some of the richest marine communities on Earth. They created physical structure, sheltered countless species, and served as engines of biological productivity. After the collapse, reefs virtually disappeared from the fossil record. For nearly 10 million years, complex reef systems remained absent. This extraordinary interval is known as the reef gap, one of the clearest geological signals of how profoundly ocean ecosystems had been disrupted. Across those millions of years, life persisted. Small survivors diversified. Food webs slowly expanded. New lineages emerged, and old ecological roles gradually reappeared. Yet the imbalance remained unmistakable. Destruction had occurred within a geological moment. Restoration required spans of time so vast that continents themselves continued drifting while recovery unfolded. The contrast remains preserved in stone. Less than 1 million years of relentless environmental upheaval brought life to the edge. Rebuilding the richness that had been lost demanded many millions more. In the rocks of the early Triassic, the difference between breaking and rebuilding is written with remarkable clarity. A curious silence sits at the center of the Great Dying. After all the fossils have been cataloged, after the chemical signatures in ancient rocks have been measured, and after decades of study have reconstructed the broad outlines of the catastrophe, one question remains surprisingly difficult to answer. Why did certain creatures survive while others disappeared forever? Science can identify patterns. It can recognize traits shared by many survivors. Yet, when attention narrows from groups to individual lineages, certainty begins to fade. The boundary between extinction and survival often appears less orderly than expected. Evolution provides clues, but not always complete explanations. Lystrosaurus offers one of the clearest examples. Before the catastrophe, it was only one member of a diverse community of dicynodonts. Many of its relatives possessed similar body plans and occupied comparable ecological roles. Yet when the crisis passed, Lystrosaurus remained while most of its cousins vanished. Researchers have proposed several advantages. It could consume a wide range of hardy vegetation. It spent time underground. It tolerated environmental instability better than many larger animals. Each explanation carries weight, yet none fully resolves the mystery. No single trait seems sufficient to explain such extraordinary success. The oceans present similar puzzles. Ammonoids came astonishingly close to complete extinction. Evidence suggests that perhaps only one or two lineages survived. From those few remnants emerged an enormous evolutionary expansion that eventually produced hundreds of new species. The narrowness of that escape raises another possibility. Survival may sometimes have depended not on superior adaptation, but on location. A population occupying a fortunate refuge might persist, while an equally capable population elsewhere vanished. This possibility introduces an uncomfortable role for chance. Paleontologists have identified lineages that appeared well suited to harsh conditions, yet disappeared entirely. At the same time, some survivors display no obvious advantage that clearly separated them from the dead. Such patterns suggest that catastrophe operates under different rules than ordinary evolution. When environmental systems collapse rapidly and simultaneously, outcomes can become surprisingly unpredictable. The familiar phrase, survival of the fittest, captures only part of the story. Fitness is always measured against a particular world. An adaptation that provides tremendous success under stable conditions may become a burden when conditions transform abruptly. Specialization illustrates this principle clearly. Organisms finely tuned to specific foods, habitats, temperatures, or ecological relationships often thrive while those conditions remain intact. When those conditions disappear, specialization can become a trap from which there is no escape. Generalists fared better overall. Creatures able to consume many food sources, occupy different habitats, tolerate fluctuating climates, and reproduce relatively quickly, appeared repeatedly among the survivors. Flexibility proved valuable in a world where predictability had vanished. Yet even this pattern is incomplete. Numerous generalists still disappeared. Adaptability increased the odds, but it offered no guarantee. Perhaps that is what makes the Great Dying so unsettling to study. The survivors were not simply the strongest, smartest, fastest, or most efficient. They occupied a narrow intersection of circumstance, biology, geography, and timing. Some possessed useful traits, some found refuge. Some benefited from conditions that happened to favor their way of life, and some may have endured because fortune briefly stood beside them while the rest of the world fell away. Long before true mammals appeared, another branch of the therapsid family tree was already experimenting with features that seemed to belong to a future age. The therocephalians rarely received the attention given to more famous survivors of the Great Dying, yet for a brief interval after the catastrophe, they remained among the most advanced land vertebrates on Earth, carrying with them anatomical innovations that hinted at possibilities still far beyond the horizon. In the Permian world, therocephalians occupied a wide range of ecological roles. Some were predators, some were omnivores, and others likely lived flexible lifestyles that shifted with opportunity and circumstance. Their success had been built gradually over millions of years. By the time the extinction arrived, they were already distinguished from many other reptiles by a collection of increasingly mammal-like characteristics. Their skulls contained a secondary palate, allowing them to breathe while processing food. Their teeth were differentiated into specialized forms rather than repeated rows of identical structures. Their limbs were positioned in ways that supported more efficient movement than the sprawling postures common among many earlier vertebrates. When the biological crisis swept across the planet, these advantages did not guarantee safety. Most therocephalian diversity disappeared alongside countless other lineages, yet several branches endured. In the bleak landscapes of the early Triassic, therocephalians and cynodonts represented some of the closest living approaches to the mammalian condition. They occupied a world stripped of much of its former complexity, carrying evolutionary experiments that had somehow survived the collapse. Their fossils reveal another recurring pattern of the recovery era. Like many survivors discussed earlier, therocephalians became smaller after crossing the extinction boundary. The Lilliput effect appears clearly within their lineage. Bodies that had once been larger and more varied gave way to compact descendants, better suited to an environment where energy was precious and resources remained uncertain. Smaller animals required less food, matured more quickly, and could exploit refuges inaccessible to larger competitors. Researchers suspect that their survival strategies overlapped with those seen in other successful therapsids. Some may have relied on burrows during periods of environmental instability. Dietary flexibility likely helped them endure changing food availability. Periods of reduced metabolic activity may also have provided advantages when conditions deteriorated beyond normal limits. None of these adaptations alone explains survival, but together they formed a toolkit that improved the odds in a world where odds mattered enormously. For a time, those strategies worked. Therocephalians diversified during the early Triassic and reoccupied portions of the ecological landscape left vacant by extinction. Yet survival and dominance are not the same thing. As millions of years passed, another group of therapsids began advancing more rapidly. Cynodonts developed increasingly efficient bodies, faster life cycles, and traits that moved steadily closer to the mammalian blueprint. Gradually, therocephalians lost ground. Their diversity diminished while cynodonts expanded into new opportunities. Eventually, the lineage faded from the fossil record, leaving no living descendants behind. Yet, their story remains quietly remarkable. They survived a catastrophe that erased most life on Earth, endured for millions of years afterward, and helped bridge a transitional chapter between vanished worlds and those still to come. Some survivors inherited the future, others ensured that the future had time to arrive. Hidden within ancient bones is a record of time itself. Long after muscles vanished and skin decayed, microscopic layers remained preserved, capturing the rhythm of growth experienced by animals that lived through one of the most difficult periods in Earth's history. When paleontologists began examining these structures in detail, they discovered evidence that survival after the Great Dying involved more than enduring harsh conditions. It also required changing the pace of life. Many Permian therapsids had lived according to a slower schedule. Growth rings, preserved within their bones, suggest that they matured gradually across multiple years. Energy was invested in reaching larger body sizes, developing stronger skeletons, and surviving through repeated seasonal cycles before reproduction began. In a relatively stable world, such a strategy carried advantages. Larger adults could compete more effectively, defend territories, and invest more resources in individual offspring. The early Triassic tells a different story. Fossils from survivors reveal a noticeable shift in growth patterns. Animals belonging to lineages such as Lystrosaurus, Thermocephalians, and Cynodonts often reached reproductive maturity much earlier than their Permian predecessors. Instead of spending years growing before producing offspring, many appear to have begun reproducing while still remarkably young. This transformation reflects a fundamental change in life history strategy. The world emerging from the extinction was unpredictable and dangerous. Food supplies fluctuated, habitats changed rapidly, mortality remained high. Under such conditions, delaying reproduction carried increasing risk. An animal that waited several years before producing offspring might never survive long enough to do so. Earlier reproduction provided a different path, one that sacrificed prolonged growth in exchange for a greater chance of passing genes to the next generation. Ecologists describe this approach as a shift toward what is known as R selection. In simple terms, survival becomes less dependent on the success of individual organisms and more dependent on producing offspring quickly and repeatedly. When environmental instability claims large numbers of individuals, population persistence often depends upon speed. The strategy is not elegant or efficient in the traditional sense. It is resilient. The mathematical consequences are profound. A lineage capable of reproducing at 1 year of age, rather than 3, can generate far more generations across the same span of time. Each generation creates opportunities for adaptation, recovery, and expansion. In a world where countless individuals fail to survive adulthood, shortening the interval between generations can dramatically improve long-term persistence. Remarkably, evidence for this shift remains visible within the fossil record itself. Bone tissue grows in layers, somewhat like the annual rings of a tree. By examining these microscopic structures, researchers can estimate growth rates and age at maturity. Across the extinction boundary, many survivors display fewer growth rings before reaching adulthood. The change is measurable, preserved not in speculation but in the architecture of ancient skeletons. Seen from this perspective, survival after the Great Dying was not only a matter of where creatures lived or what they ate, it was also a matter of timing. The survivors adjusted the tempo of their lives to match a harsher world. They grew faster, matured sooner, and passed life forward with greater urgency. In the silent language of fossilized bone, the recovery of life was already accelerating long before ecosystems themselves had healed. Imagine the world during the worst years of the Great Dying, not as a single uniform catastrophe, but as a patchwork of conditions scattered across an enormous and wounded planet. Some regions became nearly impossible for complex life to endure. Others, by circumstance rather than design, remained slightly less hostile. Within those rare pockets, survival may have found its narrowest foothold. Scientists use the term refugia to describe these isolated havens. A refugium is not a paradise. It is not a place of abundance or ecological stability. Instead, it is a location where conditions remain just survivable while surrounding regions become deadly. Throughout Earth's history, refugia have sheltered populations during periods of climate upheaval, glaciation, drought, and extinction. During the Great Dying, they may have played an especially important role. As global temperatures climbed, geography itself became a powerful determinant of survival. Equatorial regions appear to have suffered some of the most extreme environmental stress. Climate models suggest that temperatures near the tropics may have risen beyond the physiological limits of many large animals. Vast stretches of land that had once supported thriving ecosystems became increasingly difficult to inhabit. In contrast, higher latitudes likely offered somewhat cooler conditions. They were still harsh, but harshness exists on a spectrum, and even a modest reduction in temperature could have dramatically improved the odds of persistence. This possibility has important implications for understanding survivors, such as Lystrosaurus. Fossils of this resilient animal appear across nearly every major landmass connected within Pangaea. Such a broad distribution may have functioned as a form of biological insurance. While populations in one region faced collapse, others living farther from the most severe climatic extremes may have endured. Survival may have depended not only on adaptability, but also on occupying enough territory that at least some populations happened to reside in safer locations. Freshwater systems may have provided another layer of refuge. Certain river valleys and lake environments could have buffered organisms from the full force of atmospheric disruption. Water availability, localized vegetation, and microclimates may have created islands of relative stability within otherwise degraded landscapes. For freshwater species, these environments may have represented some of the last remaining strongholds. The oceans reveal a similar pattern. Surface waters experienced severe warming, declining oxygen levels, and repeated chemical disturbances, yet deeper environments sometimes remained more stable. Conditions there were far from ideal, but cooler temperatures and reduced variability may have allowed some organisms to persist below the most heavily affected zones. Later, descendants of these survivors could expand outward as marine ecosystems slowly recovered. The concept of refugia changes how extinction is understood. Traditional narratives often emphasize biological superiority, as though survival automatically belonged to the most capable organisms. The fossil record suggests a more complicated reality. Adaptations certainly mattered. Flexibility mattered. Reproductive strategies mattered. Yet geography also influenced outcomes in profound ways. A lineage could possess every useful trait and still disappear if trapped in the wrong location. Another might survive because a small population happened to occupy a corner of the world where conditions remained barely tolerable. In that sense, the history of survival is partly a map. It reflects not only what a creature was capable of becoming, but where it happened to stand when the planet changed around it. Beneath the stories of surviving reptiles, recovering forests, and scattered refuges existed another world, one so small that its inhabitants left no footprints, no burrows, and no skeletons. Yet during the darkest years following the Great Dying, this hidden realm became one of the most important forces on Earth. While many complex organisms struggled to persist, microbes entered a brief period of renewed prominence, unlike anything seen for hundreds of millions of years. For much of the Permian, microscopic life had existed as the foundation beneath larger ecosystems. Countless bacteria, algae, and other microorganisms carried out essential biological work, but they did so within environments crowded by grazers, predators, and competitors. Marine animals fed upon microbial communities. Complex food webs limited their expansion. Their influence remained vast, yet often hidden beneath the visible architecture of life. The extinction changed those relationships almost overnight in geological terms. Entire communities of seafloor organisms vanished. Many shell-forming animals disappeared from shallow marine environments. Grazing pressure collapsed. Ecological barriers that had constrained microbial populations weakened or vanished altogether. Across certain coastal regions, microorganisms found themselves occupying habitats that had suddenly become empty. In these newly available spaces, microbial mats expanded across broad stretches of seafloor. These layered communities of photosynthetic bacteria formed dense living carpets that trapped sediments and altered local chemistry. In some places, they produced structures known as stromatolites, distinctive formations built gradually through microbial growth. Stromatolites had once been among the dominant biological features of Earth's ancient oceans, flourishing long before animals became abundant. By the Permian, they had largely retreated into marginal environments. Their return after the extinction represented something extraordinary, ecosystems briefly resembling a much older Earth. The effect was so profound that portions of the early Triassic ocean floor appeared more similar to Precambrian environments than to the rich marine ecosystems that had existed immediately before the catastrophe. It was not evolution moving forward toward greater complexity. Instead, it was a temporary biological retreat, a return to simpler ecological foundations after the collapse of more elaborate systems. A related pattern unfolded on land. Geological layers deposited immediately after the extinction contain immense quantities of fungal spores, evidence for the fungal spike recognized at sites around the world. As forests died and organic material accumulated, fungi and microbes expanded rapidly. They consumed dead vegetation, recycled nutrients, and processed enormous quantities of biological debris. For a brief interval, decomposer communities became among the most active components of terrestrial ecosystems. These microbial and fungal populations were doing far more than merely surviving. They maintained essential planetary functions. They cycled carbon, sulfur, nitrogen, and other elements through damaged environments. Photosynthetic microbes continued producing oxygen. Decomposer organisms returned nutrients to exhausted soils and waterways. Even amid ecological collapse, the basic machinery of life continued turning. Their role is easy to overlook because it operated largely beyond ordinary sight. Yet the recovery of complex ecosystems depended upon these microscopic foundations. Before forests could spread, before animals could diversify, and before food webs could regain complexity, the smallest organisms on Earth held the system together. In many ways, the first stage of recovery belonged not to giants or survivors with famous names, but to life at its most ancient scale. For many years, the recovery of the oceans after the Great Dying was imagined as an almost endless silence. According to the traditional picture, marine ecosystems remained impoverished for between 5 and 10 million years, drifting through a prolonged biological winter while life struggled to regain even a fraction of its former complexity. The extinction had been so severe and the environmental damage so widespread that recovery seemed destined to proceed at a glacial pace. That view has begun to change. In the limestone rocks of southern China, paleontologists uncovered an extraordinary fossil community known as the Guiyang biota, dated to approximately 250.7 to 250.8 million years ago, only about 1 million years after the peak of the extinction, the site preserves an unexpectedly rich collection of organisms. Ammonoids drifted through the water column. Bivalves occupied the seafloor. Conodonts, strange eel-like animals armed with mineralized feeding structures, moved through the recovering ecosystem. Early shrimps and sponges also appear within the assemblage, together forming a community far more diverse than scientists once thought possible, so soon after the catastrophe. The discovery did not erase the severity of the extinction. Vast regions of the oceans remained stressed, unstable, and depleted, yet it revealed that recovery was not unfolding everywhere at the same speed. In certain locations, conditions improved rapidly enough for surprisingly complex ecosystems to reassemble, while other marine regions still struggled under the lingering effects of warming, oxygen loss, and disrupted chemistry. This emerging picture suggests a patchwork world rather than a uniform one. Some seas remained ecological wastelands for extended periods. Others became islands of opportunity where surviving lineages expanded and diversified. Local differences in temperature, circulation patterns, nutrient availability, and dissolved oxygen may have created pockets where recovery could begin earlier than expected. Instead of a single global timeline, there were many overlapping timelines unfolding across different oceans. Among the most surprising findings is the identity of some of the earliest organisms to return. Conventional ecological theory would predict that simple bottom-dwelling species should recover first, gradually rebuilding food webs from the base upward. Evidence from several early Triassic sites suggests something stranger occurred. Mobile predators appeared remarkably early. Free-swimming hunters occupied marine environments before many lower levels of the ecosystem had fully recovered. This pattern has puzzled researchers because it reverses expectations. The rebuilding of ocean communities seems to have followed pathways unlike those observed in most modern ecosystems. Rather than progressing neatly from simple foundations toward larger consumers, portions of the marine world may have reassembled through a more complicated and uneven sequence. Recovery was not a straightforward march. It was experimental, fragmented, and shaped by local circumstances. Each new fossil discovery continues to refine this story. Sites such as the Guiyang biota remind us that extinction and recovery are rarely uniform processes. Even during one of the darkest chapters in the history of life, pockets of resilience emerged sooner than anyone once imagined, preserving the first signs that the oceans were beginning to breathe again. Few fossils tell a larger story than a map. Long before scientists reconstructed ancient climates or traced the chemistry of vanished oceans, they noticed something unusual about Lystrosaurus. Its remains appeared again and again in rocks separated by enormous distances. The same sturdy survivor emerged from deserts, mountains, polar regions, and sedimentary basins spread across what are now several continents. Piece by piece, those discoveries revealed one of the most extraordinary geographic ranges known for any land vertebrate in Earth's history. Lystrosaurus fossils have been recovered from South Africa, Russia, China, India, Mongolia, and Antarctica. During the early Triassic, these regions were joined within the immense supercontinent Pangaea, yet they still represented dramatically different environments. Some occupied warmer interior zones. Others lay at higher latitudes, where seasonal darkness persisted for long stretches of the year. Across this vast, connected landscape, Lystrosaurus established itself with remarkable success. Its distribution offers a glimpse into the unusual character of the recovery world. Under ordinary ecological conditions, animal populations encounter competitors, predators, and established communities that limit expansion. The aftermath of the Great Dying was different. Ecological barriers had been shattered, countless herbivores had disappeared, predator diversity had collapsed, habitats that had once supported complex communities contained only scattered survivors. In that emptiness, a resilient generalist could move into territories that might previously have been inaccessible. The Antarctic discoveries are among the most revealing. Today, Antarctica is a frozen continent buried beneath ice, but during the early Triassic, it occupied a different position and supported terrestrial ecosystems. Even so, it remained a high-latitude environment with pronounced seasonal variation. Fossils from these deposits demonstrate that Lystrosaurus tolerated conditions extending well beyond warm equatorial settings. It was not confined to a narrow climatic preference. Its adaptability allowed it to persist across a broad environmental spectrum, an advantage of enormous value during a period when climates remained unstable. As researchers compared specimens from different regions, another detail emerged. Lystrosaurus was not a single uniform population spread across the globe. Paleontologists have identified four distinct species within the genus. While all shared the same fundamental body plan, local populations were beginning to diverge. Geographic separation, environmental differences, and evolutionary pressures were gradually producing variation. Even during an age dominated by a handful of survivors, evolution had already resumed its patient work. For roughly 5 million years, this was in many ways a Lystrosaurus world. Fossil assemblages from numerous locations are so heavily dominated by the genus that its presence defines entire intervals of early Triassic history. Yet dominance did not last forever. Recovery slowly generated new competitors, new herbivores, and new predators. Archosauromorphs diversified. Cynodonts expanded into fresh ecological roles. Communities became richer and more layered with each passing million years. The decline of Lystrosaurus was neither sudden nor dramatic. Its supremacy faded gradually as ecosystems regained complexity. Species by species, niche by niche, the biological fabric of the planet thickened once again. The creature that had inherited the earth eventually became part of a larger story, leaving behind a fossil trail that stretches across continents and records one of the greatest survival journeys ever preserved in stone. Hidden within every mammal is a history far older than bones, older than continents in their present shapes, older even than the dinosaurs that would one day dominate the earth. It is a history carried not in memory but in inheritance, passed forward across an unbroken chain of lives, stretching back to the survivors of the Great Dying. Every mouse beneath a hedgerow, every whale crossing an ocean basin, every bat navigating the darkness, every elephant moving across a savanna, and every human being alive today belongs to that same ancient lineage. The connection begins with the therapsids that endured when so many others disappeared. Among their descendants were the cynodonts, creatures that occupied a world still struggling beneath the weight of catastrophe. They were not yet mammals, but many of the characteristics that would eventually define mammals were already emerging within them. Over millions of years, these lineages diversified throughout the Triassic. By roughly 225 million years ago, the first true mammals had appeared, small animals living quietly alongside larger reptiles. They survived another extinction at the end of the Cretaceous, 66 million years ago, and from those survivors emerged every mammalian lineage alive today. What makes this history remarkable is how many familiar traits were already taking shape in those distant ancestors. Warm blood allowed activity across a wider range of conditions. Hair provided insulation and sensory information. Teeth became increasingly specialized, capable of processing food more efficiently than the simpler dentitions of earlier animals. Parental care grew more prolonged, increasing the chances that offspring would survive to adulthood. These features were not created all at once. They accumulated gradually, generation after generation, beginning as small advantages in a difficult world. Among the cynodonts, Thrinaxodon occupies a special place. Fossils reveal an animal adapted for endurance. Its limbs were positioned beneath the body in a more efficient posture. Evidence from the snout suggests the presence of whiskers. Bone growth patterns indicate a metabolism more active than that of many contemporary reptiles. When conditions became severe, it could retreat underground and enter prolonged periods of dormancy. None of these adaptations evolved with a future mammalian world in mind. They solved immediate problems, yet those solutions became part of a legacy that endured. Imagine that small animal resting within its burrow during the harsh years after the extinction. Outside lay a landscape transformed beyond recognition. Inside, life persisted quietly. The significance of that moment was invisible. No signal announced that a lineage essential to the future had survived. Yet, within countless ordinary acts of feeding, resting, breeding, and enduring, evolutionary possibilities remained alive. The abilities we often take for granted still bear the imprint of that inheritance. The regulation of body temperature, the sensitivity of hair against the skin, the complex structures of hearing, and countless other mammalian characteristics trace their origins through an uninterrupted sequence of ancestors, reaching back toward those early survivors. The Great Dying came closer than any other event to ending complex life on Earth. Yet from the narrow margin that remained emerged the lineage that eventually produced us. In that sense, the story of those survivors is not separate from our own, it is our beginning. If the Great Dying left behind a lesson written across continents, oceans, and millions of years of fossilized history, it is that survival followed patterns. The survivors came from different branches of life and inhabited very different environments. Yet when paleontologists examine the evidence closely, familiar themes appear again and again. From microbes spreading across seafloors to burrowing therapsids enduring on land, the organisms that persisted often shared a surprisingly consistent set of characteristics. One of the clearest patterns was size. Smaller bodies repeatedly proved advantageous when ecosystems collapsed. Large animals require substantial amounts of food, extensive territories, and relatively predictable environmental conditions. During the crisis, those requirements became burdens. Food webs fragmented, plant communities shrank, and ecological stability disappeared. Small organisms needed fewer resources and could survive on quantities of food that would have been insignificant to larger species. They matured faster, reproduced sooner, and could often shelter in places unavailable to larger animals. In a world defined by scarcity, small size became an asset rather than a limitation. Diet mattered just as much. The fossil record suggests that specialists suffered disproportionately. Species dependent on particular plants, prey, habitats, or environmental conditions found themselves trapped when those resources vanished. Generalists faced the catastrophe from a different position. They could shift between food sources, exploit unfamiliar opportunities, and tolerate changing circumstances. A creature capable of eating many things had options when preferred foods disappeared. Flexibility in diet transformed uncertainty from a fatal obstacle into a manageable challenge. The pace of reproduction formed another recurring theme. Evidence preserved in fossil bone indicates that many surviving lineages reached maturity more rapidly than their predecessors. Earlier reproduction allowed populations to replace losses more quickly and generate new generations before environmental conditions shifted again. In unstable ecosystems, longevity mattered less than continuity. Species capable of producing offspring early and frequently gained a mathematical advantage that accumulated across generations, helping them persist through prolonged periods of ecological stress. Survivors also tended to possess broader environmental tolerances. The conditions of the early Triassic fluctuated dramatically. Temperatures rose and fell. Oxygen availability changed. Water chemistry varied across regions. Organisms adapted to narrow ranges often found themselves unable to cope when familiar conditions disappeared. By contrast, species capable of enduring wider variations in heat, oxygen levels, salinity, or acidity possessed a crucial buffer against uncertainty. Their success did not come from perfection within a single environment, but from competence across many. Behavior added another layer to survival. Some animals retreated underground, others entered states of reduced activity that lowered energy demands. Certain populations shifted their distributions toward more favorable regions when local conditions deteriorated. These responses required no extraordinary intelligence. They reflected behavioral flexibility, the capacity to alter habits when circumstances changed. Such adjustments often provided enough time for physiological adaptations and reproductive strategies to do the rest. Taken together, these traits form something like a recurring pattern in the history of extinction. Small size, flexible diets, rapid reproduction, broad tolerance, and adaptable behavior appear repeatedly among the lineages that endured Earth's greatest crises. The details vary from event to event, but the underlying principles remain remarkably consistent. Across hundreds of millions of years, catastrophe has repeatedly favored organisms capable of adjusting rather than resisting, enduring rather than dominating. In that sense, the fossil record preserves not only the story of survival, but the enduring rules by which survival is most often achieved. The rocks that preserve the great dying do not belong entirely to the distant past. Their lessons extend forward through time, carried in chemistry, climate, and the fragile relationships that connect living things to one another. When scientists examine the chain of events that unfolded 252 million years ago, they find patterns that feel unexpectedly familiar. The circumstances are not identical, the causes are different, and the timescales are not the same. Yet certain processes echo across the immense gulf of time with remarkable clarity. One of those echoes lies in the oceans. Today, vast quantities of carbon dioxide released into the atmosphere do not remain in the air. More than a third is absorbed by seawater, where it alters ocean chemistry. As carbon dioxide dissolves, it forms weak acids that gradually lower the water's pH. Marine organisms that rely on calcium carbonate shells or skeletons become increasingly vulnerable as acidity rises. During the Great Dying, ocean acidification was one of several forces that destabilized marine ecosystems. The same chemical pathway exists today, unfolding more gradually, but according to the same fundamental principles of chemistry. Temperature tells a similar story. Since the beginning of industrialization, global average temperatures have risen by more than 1 degree Celsius. What concerns many researchers is not simply the temperature itself, but the pace at which change occurs. Life can often adapt to gradual environmental shifts across long spans of time. Rapid change is more difficult. Ecosystems are networks of countless interdependent relationships, and when conditions move faster than species can adjust, disruptions accumulate. The fossil record repeatedly demonstrates that biological communities are often most vulnerable during periods of accelerated environmental transformation. Another pattern appears in the rate at which species are disappearing. Current extinction estimates vary, yet many studies suggest losses are occurring at rates dozens to hundreds of times higher than long-term background levels. Individual extinctions may seem isolated when viewed one at a time, but the fossil record teaches that biodiversity functions as an interconnected system. Every disappearance removes a thread. When enough threads are weakened simultaneously, resilience begins to erode. Perhaps the most important lesson from the Great Dying is that no single factor acted alone. Volcanic gases altered the atmosphere, warming affected climate systems, ocean chemistry shifted, oxygen levels declined, ecological relationships fractured. Each stress amplified the others. The catastrophe emerged not from one overwhelming blow, but from many pressures accumulating together until recovery became impossible for most species. Modern environmental challenges display a similar tendency toward interaction. Habitat loss influences population stability. Climate change reshapes ecosystems. Pollution alters water and soil quality. Invasive species disrupt established relationships. Ocean acidification affects marine food webs. Each pressure can be studied independently, yet living systems experience them simultaneously. There is, however, one profound difference between the world of the Great Dying and the world today. The organisms that endured that ancient catastrophe possessed no awareness of the forces reshaping their planet. They responded only through biology, behavior, and chance. We occupy a unique position in Earth's history. Through science, observation, and memory preserved in stone, we can recognize patterns long before they reach their final consequences. The ancient record does not predict the future, but it offers a rare opportunity to understand how fragile, complex worlds can become when many stresses converge at once. A fossil bone can appear solid, permanent, almost immune to time. Yet the story it preserves is often one of extraordinary fragility. As the evidence from the Great Dying accumulates across continents and oceans, a striking realization emerges. The world that followed was not inherited by victors. It was inherited by whatever fragments remained when the collapse finally slowed. Lystrosaurus is often presented as the emblem of survival, but survival did not look heroic. Across the early Triassic landscape, this stocky herbivore moved through environments stripped of abundance. The plants available were limited. Temperatures remained harsh. Ecological communities that had once provided stability were gone. Lystrosaurus did not conquer these conditions. It endured them. It spent time underground when the surface became hostile. It consumed whatever vegetation it could process. It reproduced and persisted because persistence was enough. The future importance of the species existed only in hindsight. For the animal itself, each day was simply another day successfully lived. The same quiet reality surrounded Thrinaxodon, hidden within burrows, sheltered from some of the instability outside. These small cynodonts survived through a combination of physiological resilience and behavioral flexibility. Their world offered few guarantees. Long periods of inactivity may have conserved precious energy. Their senses remained tuned to subtle changes in temperature, vibration, and opportunity. Nothing about their existence suggested destiny. They were not preparing to become ancestors of future mammals. They were responding to immediate challenges with whatever tools evolution had already placed at their disposal. This perspective changes the way the extinction is understood. Looking backward through millions of years, it is tempting to view survival as inevitable because survivors exist in the fossil record. Yet, the geological evidence suggests otherwise. The margin separating persistence from disappearance was remarkably narrow. A slightly longer interval of extreme warming, a broader expansion of oxygen-poor waters, or the loss of a handful of remaining refuges might have altered the outcome completely. The continuity of life rested upon populations so small and vulnerable that, in many cases, their existence can only be inferred from a scattering of fossils preserved by chance. The Great Dying demonstrates that there is no guarantee written into nature requiring complexity to continue. Ecosystems can unravel, dominant groups can vanish, entire ways of life can disappear from the planet forever. What continued after the extinction was not certainty, but possibility. Small populations carried genetic information across the bottleneck, preserving enough diversity for evolution to continue its work once conditions gradually improved. Seen from the present, the consequences of that persistence are immense. Every forest canopy, every migrating bird, every coral colony, every mammal that has ever lived traces its ancestry through that narrow passage. The chain connecting the modern world to the deep past was never a broad highway. It was a delicate connection maintained through some of the harshest conditions life has ever faced. The survivors of the Great Dying were not remarkable because they dominated the world. They were remarkable because they kept the story going. Across an interval when nearly everything was lost, a thin biological thread remained unbroken. From that thread came every complex ecosystem that followed, every lineage that flourished afterward, and every living creature that shares the earth today. Long after the worst years had passed, the planet began to change in quieter ways. The eruptions that had darkened horizons and altered climates eventually diminished. Atmospheric systems slowly regained a measure of balance. Oceans that had been destabilized for immense spans of time began the slow work of recovery. Across land and sea, the surviving lineages that had endured the catastrophe continued their patient expansion into a world that was still wounded, but no longer collapsing. The survivors were diverse despite their small numbers. Lystrosaurus wandered across vast regions of Pangaea. Thrinaxodon and other cynodonts occupied sheltered corners of recovering ecosystems. Chloria spread through marine environments where so many other shell-bearing organisms had disappeared. Ammonoids multiplied from the few lineages that had escaped extinction. Ferns covered disturbed landscapes, and insects resumed their role in the circulation of nutrients. Beneath it all, microbial communities continued maintaining the biological foundations upon which larger ecosystems depended. Each lineage contributed a small piece to the rebuilding of Earth's living systems. What followed was not a return to the Permian world. The familiar ecological structures of that age were gone. Entire groups that had once dominated landscapes and oceans never returned. The recovery instead generated something new. Evolution worked with the survivors available, not with the species that had vanished. Over millions of years, fresh ecological relationships emerged. New food webs formed. New evolutionary experiments appeared. The result was the Mesozoic world, a planet increasingly populated by organisms whose existence depended upon opportunities created by the extinction itself. From surviving herbivorous therapsids emerged descendants adapted to changing environments. From cynodont lineages came the first true mammals, small creatures carrying traits that would one day define an entire branch of life. Archosaur survivors diversified into forms that eventually produced crocodilians, pterosaurs, and dinosaurs. Marine survivors generated new radiations that repopulated the seas. Plant communities transformed landscapes that had once seemed incapable of supporting complex ecosystems again. Recovery was not restoration, it was reinvention. There is a quiet lesson hidden within that transformation. The Great Dying remains the most severe extinction event known from the fossil record. Yet even such a catastrophe did not halt the evolutionary story. Instead, it altered its direction. The future belonged neither to the largest nor to the most dominant organisms of the Permian. It belonged to the lineages that managed to persist through conditions that nearly erased them. Their success was measured not by power, but by continuity. That continuity extends all the way to the present. Deep within every living mammal are biological features inherited through an unbroken chain stretching back to those ancient survivors. The regulation of body temperature, the refinement of hearing, the specialization of teeth, and countless other characteristics emerged through evolutionary pathways that remained open only because certain small creatures endured when so many others could not. The Great Dying was the end of almost everything that existed at the time. Yet from that ending emerged every complex terrestrial ecosystem that followed, every mammal, every bird, every forest of later ages, and eventually every human life. The inheritance of those survivors remains alive today, carried forward through an uninterrupted history spanning 252 million years, a remarkably long journey sustained by a thread that never quite broke.